The last issue we were talking about is whether Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is the Araisa or Drabanan. Actually, there are three Shitas in Rishonim. The Baal Hamor actually says Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is not even a Chi of Drabanan, it's only a Minag Bialma. But as I say, the Baal Hamor we don't really count here. Most Rishonim say Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is Midrabanan, and others say Shemitah Bisman Hazeh is the Araisa. What is the logic of the machlokas? What is the machlokas based upon? I'm reviewing a little bit. The machlokas is based upon the idea that everybody admits, everybody says, there is no yovel, there is no observance of yovel bisman hazeh. And that is because yovel requires that, number one, most of the Jews live in Eretz Yisrael, but number two, don't forget number two, they are living in their tribal allotments. They're living in the chalokim of Eretz Yisrael that were given to them as part of their tribes. Today, we do not have most of the Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, and although we're close to it, but we certainly don't have tribal divisions. Therefore, there is no yovel. That's according to everybody. And again, what that means is, not only is there no yovel today, but there was no yovel during the second Beis HaMikdash, because the 10 tribes had been exiled, and there was not even yovel in the last 100 years of the first Beis HaMikdash, when the 10 tribes were exiled. So we've been without yovel quite a long time, because of the din of Rov Yosheveha Aleha. So most Rishonim say Shemitah follows yovel. If there's no yovel, there is no Shemitah, and therefore Shemitah is midrabanan. Tosfos asks the kasha, well, okay, if there's no yovel, there's no Shemitah, but the Rabbanan enacted Shemitah, why didn't the Rabbanan enact yovel? Tosfos says, the Chachamim did not want to create a situation where you wouldn't be permitted to work the land for 2 years in a row. Because year 49, the year before yovel, is always a Shemitah year. If the rabbis would enact yovel, you'd have 2 years in a row without farming. That would be too much of a hardship. So therefore, they took away yovel. So the bottom line is, we do not keep yovel even midrabanan today. In fact, if you were to ask me what year in the yovel cycle are we coming up to, I wouldn't. I could find out. I mean, the information can be figured out, but it's not in our consciousness. We're not so aware of it because there is no yovel observance. Shemitah, according to most Rishonim, is midrabanan. However, interestingly enough, there is one observance that we have even today that commemorates yovel. And it's quite amazing, and that is the minhag that at the end of Yom Kippur, we blow the shofar. Right? Now, that's not a chiyuv, that's a minhag. It's interesting that in popular consciousness of, let's say, Jews who are not religious, the blowing of the shofar has great, great, great symbolic meaning. In fact, you'll often hear people say, I cut out after Shachris, I missed Musaf and everything else, but I got to come back for shofar blowing. I remember reading the policeman on duty says, I got to get off the beat, I got to hear shofar blowing. Okay. In fact, some shows actually have a practice that they don't blow shofar till after Ma'ariv. Because people think, once shofar blowing, they leave. So to be sure that people, these are Orthodox synagogues, to be sure that people in an Orthodox synagogue will stay for the weekday Ma'ariv after Ne'ilah, they delay shofar blowing because they know nobody is going to leave until they hear the shofar blowing, right? So they do it. Actually, according to that, maybe they ought to delay shofar blowing until Shachris the next day. That would be that would be even better. But okay, now why do we blow shofar after Yom Kippur? So the Torah says the following: yovel, when it existed, actually starts on Yom Kippur. It does not start in Rosh Hashanah. And they would blow the shofar on Yom Kippur. Besides the Rosh Hashanah blowing, but on yovel, they would blow the shofar on Yom Kippur, and that was the signal that the slaves were now free when they heard that shofar blowing. Now, Today, we can't blow a shofar on Yom Kippur because we don't have yovel, and you're not allowed to blow a shofar on Shabbos, like Shabbos. Yom Kippur is like Shabbos. But to commemorate yovel, which had a shofar blowing on Yom Kippur, we blow the shofar after Yom Kippur, l'zecher, the Yom Kippur of yovel. That's what the Torah says. So the Maharal asks the obvious question. So why do you blow it every year? You ought to blow the shofar every 50 years. When it would be a yovel year, blow the shofar every 50 years, l'zecher yovel. Why are you commemorating yovel every single Yom Kippur? It's a very, very good kasha. So Maharal gives a very, very beautiful thought. The Maharal says, it's not that I'm commemorating yovel. Why would I commemorate yovel every year if yovel is every 50 years? But rather, the same idea that the meaning of the shofar of yovel is that the slaves go free, so too Hashem is saying, you're free of your averas. You're no longer enslaved. It's the end of Yom Kippur, meaning an avera is like a chain around me. It enslaves me. It constricts me. It limits me. It creates barriers of separation between myself and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when that shofar is blown at the end of Yom Kippur, it's telling us all, you are liberated. And that's what the Maharal says. That's what that is what the Torah means when he says it's a zecher liyovel. Not that you're commemorating yovel, but it's the same idea that the eved now goes free. That's a really beautiful thought. In other words, to know that now you are free. Okay. But be it as it may, other than that, we do not keep yovel. And again, I don't want to repeat the point, but you'll recall that because we don't keep yovel, this also changes how we compute Shemitah. Again, interesting point. Because when you had yovel, you would count 49 years. Yovel would be a 0 year. And then the next year is year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Today, because we don't observe the yovel does not count as a 0. We just continuous count. So, which means Bisman Hazeh, meaning ever since the exile of the 10 tribes, Shemitah is earlier than it would have been, right? Everyone gets that. Shemitah would be later when you have yovel than it is when you don't have yovel, right? So not only is yovel significant in and of itself, but yovel has an effect on how you calculate the Shemitah years. Someone you have a question? Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify. Bezrat Hashem, when we have yovel back, would that mean we continue wherever we would have been in the yearly cycle, or do you start when that year you start back would be a yovel and you start scratching there?
No, you're just going to continue. Meaning when Mashiach comes, and if we're in year, let's say the 5th year of a Shemitah, we're going to, and let's assume. Okay. The question is, how would you calculate the first yovel? Yeah. So basically, you're not going to calculate from a past yovel, meaning you just count your years. When you hit 50, then that'll be your first yovel.
So from that year, you count 50.
Yep, that's correct.
Count restarts then.
Let me just think about that for a moment. Yeah, the question is, how do you start counting? So the truth is. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Meaning, how do you start the very, very first yovel? Well, okay. So actually, you're correct. If you follow the view that Shemitah B'zman Hazeh is d'Rabbanan, so when Shemitah becomes the Oraisa again, that's going to be year 1. If Shemitah is d'Oraisa even today, I think it's a little more complicated. But if you go that Shemitah is d'Rabbanan, then the year that Mashiach comes, no matter what year it is in the cycle that we've been following, now becomes year 1, and the 50th year is going to be yovel from that particular point. If Shemitah is d'Oraisa, I have to think about it, because what are you going to be counted from? But at least if you follow d'Rabbanan, that's going to be the case. Okay? So that's the idea of Shemitah and the idea of yovel. There is a Kabbalistic idea that Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan brings, and a lot of people, it is from a source, it is from a Sifrei Kabbalah, but both the Arizal and the Rav Moshe Cordovero disagreed with this cheshbon. So obviously it's hard to call it a definitive teaching of Kabbalah if the Arizal rejected it. But it is so interesting, it has absolutely nothing to do with our topic, but peripherally it's connected, that I want to go over it with you. Maybe you've heard it before, maybe you read it before. And that is, this is called the doctrine of Shemitah. We know that it's Makubal, that just as there were 6 days of creation followed by Shabbos, so too the world will go through 6 millennia, which takes you to the year 6000, and then Mashiach will come. Now granted, Mashiach can come earlier, just like you could be Makabel Shabbos earlier, but at a maximum, there'll be 6 millennia, 6,000 years, and then we usher in Yom Shekulo Shabbos, the day of the eternal Shabbos, right? That's the source of the idea that 6,000 is the end of the world as we know it. And I think I mentioned the other day that the Jewish calendar expires in the year 6,000, because by that time we know we will have a Sanhedrin and we will go back to the old way of witnesses testifying regarding the new moon. Now, what the Mekubalim say is the following. Again, the Arizal rejects it, but what some Mekubalim say is the following. Oh, by the way, I should say too, that the Gra says, and it would be interesting, somebody could write a book about this, but we don't have a book on it, that every event in a millennia corresponds to what happened in that day of creation. And therefore, right now we are in the 6th millennia, right? 5782. So this would correspond to the 6th day of creation. And you can take all the historical events and match them up. The Gra says this beremez. The Gra does not say how this works. And if one really wanted to write a study about this, you can write a very, very interesting book matching up world history to creation in various ways. Okay, so all of this is well known. But what the Mekubalim say is the following. The same way that you have 6 years and then Shemitah, and then you repeat the cycle. And you repeat the cycle 7 times until you hit the Jubilee year. So too, the world itself will go through separate cycles, meaning 6,000 years, then 1,000 years of redemption, but then the world gets destroyed and it gets recreated at a higher level for another 6,000 years, followed by 1,000 years. In other words, the Mekubalim are saying, based on Midrashim, that there is not only one creation. Rather, creation occurs in 6,000 year cycles, followed by 1,000 years of redemption. And then it is recreated at a higher spiritual level. And this will go on for 7 cycles, which is 49,000 years, until we reach the yovel, which is the grand final total redemption. Meaning there'll be multiple creations and multiple geulos, multiple Mashiachs, till you reach that highest level. Now again, I want to repeat, the Arizal and Rav Moshe Cordovero reject it, but I'm bringing this in because of a very interesting point. Yeah.
So you're saying we are in that first cycle?
So which cycle are we in? So Rav Ari Kaplan brings from these Svarim that we are actually in the 6th cycle. We are in the 6th cycle. Again, I don't know what the proof of that is, which means that Genesis, Sefer Bereshis, begins from the 6th cycle of creation, and there were 5 cycles of creation before the Chumash even begins, and we'll see how this can get you dinosaurs and the like, and there will be one more cycle of creation after the year 7,000 and the like. And this is the meaning of the statement of Chazal that God created many worlds before this world. That can refer to those prior cycles. Now, that can help you immensely in terms of figuring out the age of the earth. And again, I'm basing this on Rabbi Kaplan, but please don't write in, I know I'm changing Rabbi Kaplan's numbers because there is a kasha on some of the numbers he uses. So I know I'm not saying exactly what his numbers are, but I'm basing it on his yesod. And that is, if we assume we are in the 6th cycle, That means there were 5 cycles before us, which are not in the Chumash. Now that doesn't add very much. 5 cycles are just 35,000 years. Okay, so big deal. That doesn't really help you with the billions of years. But here is the chap. There are man years and there are God years. Since in these 5 prior cycles there were no human beings, the measurement of a year is God's measurement rather than man's measurement. What is a year of God? Well, a year of God could be anything. God is infinite. But we actually have a conversion table based on a pasuk in Tehillim. David HaMelech says, Ki 1000 shanim b'einecha, kayom esmo. 1,000 years are like one day of God. So based on this literal conversion table, one day of God equals 1,000 years. That's what David HaMelech says. Again, that's not literally the case with Hashem, but that's the figurative number that's being used. So now, if one day of God equals 1,000 years, 1 year of God, 365, equals 365 man years. So, a year of God, a God year, is 365,000 years. If there were 35,000 years in 5 prior creation cycles that were measured by God years rather than man years, then the total number of years before Chumash Bereshis begins is 365,000 times 35,000. If you take your calculator, if you can go, what number do you have?
1.2 billion.
Yeah, so you're dealing with a really, really, really large number, which kind of roughly corresponds to the geological speculation regarding age of the Earth. And that could explain dinosaurs and everything else. Now, I want to point out one thing. Sometimes people like to deal with the age of the Earth by saying the 6 days of creation were not 6 days. They were longer. But you understand, according to this pshat, we are not changing the 6 days of creation. The 6 days of creation are 24-hour days. We're not manipulating what happened in this world. Rather, we are focusing on the pre-existing worlds that were prior to Bereshis. So the idea of changing the meaning of a day, that's another answer. And people say, how can you change the meaning of a day? This is not changing the meaning of the day. This is simply Borei Olam Machriv. Now the truth is, without all of these calculations, the Tiferes Yisrael, one of the great commentaries in the Mishnah, actually said that dinosaurs could be remnants of those prior worlds that existed before this one. But Rabbi Kaplan actually, again, I'm deviating a little bit from his numbers, so please don't write me. But I'm presenting the numbers as I understand they would work, and it's a bit of a tzarachian on some of his numerical calculations. But this yesod is a remarkable yesod, and it's amazing that this figure for the age of the Earth was not derived as, an apologetic to answer some scientific objection. This is way before there was a Big Bang theory. This is way before scientists believed the age of the Earth was this old, and it's authentically from a Kabbalistic source that Rabbi Kaplan quotes. Again, I do have to emphasize, because I hate getting emails that point out I missed this and that, and that is that I know that Rav Moshe the Arizal was cholek on this. I know Rav Moshe Cordovero was cholek on this. These are the Gedolei HaMekubalim. And I know that Rabbi Meiselman in modern times totally considers this to be illegitimate for various reasons. So it's a controversial teaching, but it is such an interesting idea and such an interesting possibility that I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so that's the idea of Shemitos, taking the yovel and Shemitah analogy and applying it to the messianic redemptions and the different stages that we go through. Okay, alrighty. So now let me remind you that in the laws of Shemitah, so we're not going to be talking about yovel anymore. In the laws of Shemitah, there are 2 types of Shemitah. First of all, what does the word Shemitah mean? Shemitah means let go, release. Shamot, if I'm holding on to this pen, shamot, release it. And there are two types of releases that you do on Shemitah. One is a releasing of the land. You let go of the land. You do not farm the land. You do not plow. You do not plant. You do not fertilize. We'll talk a little bit about what you're allowed to do. So you're releasing the land. That is called Shemitah's Karka. And then there's another aspect of Shemitah that is a little less familiar, called Shemitah's kasafim. That is the releasing of loans. That if I owe you money and I don't pay you by the end of Shemitah, the loan is released. There's an Isser D'Oraisa for you to demand payment or even to ask me to pay. Now, there are two important differences between Shemitah's kasafim and Shemitah's Karka. Difference number one, Shemitah's Karka only applies in Eretz Yisrael. There is no law of Shemitah outside of Eretz Yisrael. Shemitah's kasafim applies even outside of Eretz Yisrael. So if I lent you money in Baltimore and Shemitah passes, it is Asr D'Oraisa for me to try to collect that debt. That's chiluk number one. Chiluk number two is also very important. Shemitah's Karka gets activated at the beginning of the year. As soon as Rosh Hashanah of Tafshin Pei Bei started, Shemitah. And Bizman HaMikdash, there used to be a 30-day Tosefes Shemitah, which we don't keep today. Shemitah's kasafim gets activated at the end of Shemitah, when Shemitah is over, which means right now, if you owe me money right now, I am allowed to collect it. I can go to Beis Din, etc. The loan is not yet erased. The loan is going to be erased at the end of the Shemitah year. If I don't get my money by the 29th of Elul, the end of this year, the loan is going to get erased. So that's a second difference between Karka and Kasafim. Now, we know the Mishnah in Maseches Gittin tells us that the great Hillel Hazaken, the famous Hillel, made a takana called pruzbul. And pruzbul, strange word, is a way in which if I'm owed money, I can keep the debt alive so Shemitah does not cancel it. Now, you may say, why did Hillel do such a mean thing? I thought Hillel is the nice guy. Hillel, gives creditors way. I got a way of, you got to. The answer is he actually did it for poor people. Because people who were poor and needed money were not able to get money when they were close to Shemitah, because lenders would say, why should I lend you money? If you don't pay me within a certain amount of time, the loan is going to be erased. So it's too dangerous for me to lend you money because I'll lose my ability to collect it. So the people who were suffering by Shemitah's kasafim, on one hand, in the short term, it gives you a benefit. It erases the debt. But in a longer term, it's going to make it harder for poor people to get money. So Hillel created an institution that is called pruzbul. Now, what is pruzbul? Pruzbul simply means, let's assume I'm owed money. I lent you $10,000, right? But I want to be sure Shemitah does not erase the debt. So I go in front of a Beis Din of 3 people. They could be rabbis or even not rabbis. And I declare to them, I am transferring my debt to you. This is now a debt that is owed, not to me, but a debt that is owed to this Beis Din. The halacha is, Shemitah does not cancel money that is owed to a Beis Din. And since the money is now owed to the Beis Din then makes me a shaliach to collect the money, and they allow me to keep it. So that's kind of a way to avoid the idea of pruzbul. Now, you must make a pruzbul before Rosh Hashanah of the coming year. Some people make a pruzbul before this, last Rosh Hashanah, but the halacha is you have to make it before the loan is canceled. If you didn't make a pruzbul by the end of this year, the debt is erased. But a pruzbul, there'll be a nusach. As we get closer, I'm sure the yeshiva will distribute the appropriate text of a pruzbul. Generally speaking, you can even do it now. But I'll tell you why. Why shouldn't I do a pruzbul now? For a very simple reason. Pruzbul only covers debts that predate the prosbul. Meaning, if I would do a prosbul today, that would cover all money I'm owed today, but that wouldn't cover money that I lent tomorrow. So to be sure that the prosbul covers all of my money that is owed to me at the end of Shemitah, I want to make it the last possible day, which is Erev Rosh Hashanah of the coming year, which will be Tufshin Pei Gimel. So you can do a prosbul today if you want, but it's not going to cover any future loans that you make. What does prosbul mean? Prosbul basically means an enactment for the benefit of rich and poor, because the rich guys will be able to collect their money, and the poor guys will be able to borrow money, and therefore this was a takana of Hillel Hazaken. It's important to know, prosbul does not need the consent of the borrower. And you understand why. It wouldn't, if I couldn't do a prosbul, if you owe me money and I couldn't do a prosbul without your consent, you can just say no, and then Shemitah is going to erase it. I don't need the love's reshus, and in fact, I don't even have to tell the love that I've made a prosbul. But if I have a prosbul and I want to collect, I have to show him a written prosbul, because otherwise he doesn't have to pay me. Now, one other thing about this. Without a prosbul, it is osur d'oraisa to ask a lovet to pay you, and kal v'chomer to take him to Beis Din or secular court, which anyway is osur. But it is still considered proper for you to offer to pay. That if you owe me money, I'm not allowed to ask, but it is considered to be a proper act of piety to offer to pay. If you offer to pay, I am mechuyev to say, you don't have to pay me. But if you then persist, I'm allowed to take the money. So you can imagine the discussion here. You come to me after Shemitah, I didn't make a prosbul, and you say, I owe you $500, I really want to pay you. I say, you don't have to pay me. Then you turn away and walk away. So I start coughing. When am I supposed? There's supposed to be a second actor. You're supposed to say, "Afal pichein," right? All right. So that's a little bit. But all right. So hopefully the person will come back. But you're not allowed to say. You're not allowed to cough. You're not allowed to say, "Come back." Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Did you want to say?
How do you understand the concept of prosbul? Because it seems like Chazal made like a bypass system to bypass everything Torah, and like we do see like other haromot, I guess like that, like selling kameitz, like something that's how do we like first of all, like what was the Torah's original intention? Like that a poor person should really not.
So the truth of the matter is, there is a sugya in the fourth parak of Gittin, where at least according to one Mandi Amar, to Machlokas Rashi and Tosfos, the heter of utilizing a prosbul only helps when Shemitah itself is the Rabbanan. Meaning to say, when Shemitah is the Oraisa, you cannot evade it with prosbul. Prosbul is an evasion that is permitted. When the Oraisa you have to pay, because the Shemitah is the Rabbanan. Remember, it's all like a bunch of dominoes. If there's no yovel, because most of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, there's no Shemitah's karka. And if there's no Shemitah's karka, there's no Shemitah's kasafim. So yovel, Shemitah's karka, Shemitah's kasafim are all connected. Yovel, however, was not revived even rabbinically. Karka and kasafim was revived rabbinically. But since it's only rabbinic, that actually means the Oraisa, the Leiva, does have to pay. It's only midrabanan he doesn't. So the prosbul is putting it back on the Oraisa level. Einachinami, when Shemitah was the Oraisa, again, it's a machlokes in the sugya how to learn, but many say that prosbul would not help under those circumstances.
At Hillel's time, Shemitah was Rabbanan?
Say again?
So at Hillel's time, so Shemitah was
Well, yes, because once again, Shemitah becomes the Rabbanan as soon as there's no yovel. Remember, there was no yovel in the Bayis Sheni. Hillel was the Bayis Sheni, and even in the Bayis Rishon after the exile of the 10 tribes. Yeah.
What would be the halachic implications today if I was to go to a bank and get a personal loan and maybe 10,000 shekels for 5 years, and there's a Shemitah year coming up, so I know I'll be fine. And I choose not to pay it back.
Yes.
Am I dishonest in business? Is there any halakhic?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. First of all, the banks in Israel generally will make a principal, just like they have a heteriska. But let's assume they didn't make a principal. What would it be? So you borrow money from the bank, and when it's time to pay, you don't pay, and you basically assert a Shemitah defense. I don't have to pay you, it's Shemitah. Well, good luck with that. That's not going to work. That is a halachic defense. Halachically, you're entitled to do that, but under the laws of the state of Israel, Shemitah will not have that effect on your loan. So as a result, you are very well advised to pay, or you could be sued for all sorts of things. Now, if you're asking me, are you dishonest halachically?
Is it an avera?
If you don't pay, if you do pay.
Is it an avera? Besides the legal implications,
You mean not to pay the loan?
Not to pay, yeah. Are there
Yeah. So that's the question. The question is, So here's the problem. If you learn in Maseches Makos, some of you might have learned this on Daf Gimel. There's a discussion like this: what if I lend you money on the condition that it not be canceled on Shemitah, or at least on the condition that you don't assert Shemitah as a basis not to pay me? Meaning, I made a condition that Shemitah is not going to work. So we actually paskin that is a valid condition. Meaning, even without a principal, if there was an explicit condition in the loan that you will not avoid payment because of Shemitah, that condition can override the Torah's law. Now, if that's the case, the assumption would be that even if such language does not appear, if that's how the lender understands the situation, that would be ke'ilu there was a tanai. And if there was a tanai, halachically you're chayiv to pay. So that's a very, very good point, that in many commercial loans, there might be an absolute halachic obligation to pay the loan after Shemitah, because the loan was made with the understanding that you will have to pay after Shemitah.
Could it be that if you take out the 5-year loan, for instance, and Shemitah's come out now, could it be that the fact that it's a 5-year loan automatically implies that it's going to go beyond Shemitah, and therefore that's a condition?
That could very well be. Meaning if a lender has given you a duration that is beyond Shemitah, then by definition he's lending on the kavana that you will pay him after Shemitah.
Why was principal needed then?
So principal So principal was needed primarily for loans that become due during Shemitah. In other words, let's assume a loan becomes due 1 month before Shemitah. So if I could hide out for a month, I could get the loan erased. So principal was primarily for the loans that were due during Shemitah. You're correct. It could very well be that for loans that were due after Shemitah, perhaps a principal might be superfluous in that case. Yeah.
What's the reason that karka is a whole year before the loans?
Well, really, the question is the opposite. I mean, karka is what you don't do during the sabbatical year. The sabbatical year starts Rosh Hashanah. So the fact that karka is at the beginning of the year, that's logical, because that is the sabbatical year. The question is the other way, I guess. Why would loans be collectible during Shemitah, and it's only the end of the year that cancels? So ultimately it's a Gezeras HaKasav. I'm not sure if we have a reason. The Gemara darshans that the lashon of the pasuk implies that only when a Shemitah has passed does a loan get canceled, but not while the Shemitah is pending. So there is a difference. But Svara, I don't know why that would be so. Okay, so this is Shemitah's Karka and Shemitah's Kasafim, and it's something to be aware of. And again, there's different types of loans that don't get canceled. For example, a loan on a mashkon. If I lend you money and I take collateral for a loan, Shemitah does not cancel loans which have collateral. Shemitah only cancels what are called unsecured. I lend you money, I don't take collateral and the like. Okay, well, again, we don't have to go through all the halachas. Suffice it to say, if you don't know if you're owed money or not, you forgot, make a pruzbal, meaning there's no such thing, there's no isser of pruzbal of atala. It's not like brachal of atala. Rather, if you don't know, make a pruzbal anyway, so in the event you are owed money, you will halachically be able to collect it. And again, the way it's going to work is Erev Rosh Hashanah, along with Hataras Nedarim, the annulment of vows, there will be also a pruzbul that's going to be handed out. Okay. Now, so we have Shemitah's karka, we have Shemitah's kasafim, and then we have a third group of halachas which go to the consumer, not the farmer, but to the consumer, and that is the holiness of Shemitah produce. Shemitah produce is considered to be holy, and although you can eat it, but you have to eat it without waste, etc. Now, here is the thing. If the Torah says on Shemitah, you're not allowed to plow, you're not allowed to plant, and it even says you're not allowed to harvest, that's what it says, then how do you eat without harvesting? Like, exactly, what do you do? So here it's very important to understand that the prohibition against harvesting is not the same as the prohibition against plowing and planting. Plowing and planting is absolutely forbidden. I'm not allowed to plow, I'm not allowed to plant. That's forbidden. Harvesting is a little different. I am allowed to harvest in small quantities for daily use. I just can't harvest the whole field at one time. So let's imagine I have an apple orchard. Okay? So I'm not allowed to harvest the Shemitah apples. But I'm allowed to take a basket and take the apples that I want for one day at a time. But you also know that Shemitah fruit is hefker. It's available to everybody. So the same way I could take my basket and pick my apples, you can take your basket and pick apples. So everybody takes what they need for themselves and for their family kind of on a day-to-day basis. And the halacha actually is that you are not allowed to close up your field. If you have a fence, you cannot lock it because it's hefker. The peiros of Shemitah have to be accessible to every single Jew. If you prevent a Jew from getting your peiros of Shemitah, you are over in Isser D'Oraisa. Now, what if, however, I want to keep my gate locked because I'm afraid of wild animals coming in, or it's animals coming in, or I'm afraid of terrorists coming in, or whatever it is, criminals coming in. So the halacha is I am allowed to lock my gates if I'm afraid of animals or criminals or terrorists, but I have to put up a sign that says anyone who wants apples can call this, or any Jew who wants apples can call this phone number and we will arrange it. So there is a concept that you can lock the gates, but you have to give hours and times of availability. Right? This is the rule. Peiros Shavias are hefker. Now I'm using fruit for a particular example because grain and vegetables have a different halacha. Let's talk about fruit for now. Now, what makes an apple a Shemitah apple? That's the question. Right? The rule of hefker and limited harvesting only applies to apples that have the holiness of Shemitah. What makes an apple a Shemitah apple? So this is very interesting. The halacha is that fruits are assigned to the year in which there was blossoming. Right? If any of you have fruit trees, you know what happens. A fruit tree produces a flower, and then the flower has a bud, and the bud from the flower falls off, and then you get the fruit from the bud. In Hebrew, in the language of Chazal, this is called chanata. Chanata is the budding after the blossom falls. So a fruit, and this is very, very tricky, a fruit is assigned to the year of blossoming. I'm sorry, not blossoming, budding. That's after the blossom falls out. Budding, chanata. Now, what that means is the following. This is counterintuitive. If the bud was produced, if the bud was visible before Shemitah, even if 90% of the apple grew on Shemitah, that is not a Shemitah apple. That is a 6th-year apple. And because it is a 6th-year apple, It does not have the holiness of Shemitah. I could harvest all of those apples. I don't have to let you take those apples. Now, how do you differentiate? It's very tricky. Because it does not have Kedushat Shvi'it, because the Chanata was in the 6th year. If the Chanata was in the 7th year, however, that apple does have Shemitah laws, even if most of its growth was in the 8th year. So there will be on your apple tree, after Shemitah, apples that have to be treated with all the laws of Shemitah, including hefker and the like, because the fruit is assigned to the year of the budding. Okay? And if the budding was before Shemitah, it is a non-Shemitah apple even during Shemitah. If the budding was during Shemitah, it is a Shemitah apple even after Shemitah. Okay, the term here is chanata. By the way, during the rest of the Shemitah cycle, the same thing is true for Trumas and Masros, because different Maisros are given different years, and the Maiser of the fruit depends on what year there was the chanata. Right, so the same rules apply for Trumas and Maisros, although there's a lot of complications for that I don't want to get into, but for Shemitah, that's how you look at it. Okay? Everyone understands the basic idea. Now, that does mean, it's very, very awkward. On a given apple tree, there may be 6th-year apples, and there may be 7th-year apples. And the hefker is only permitted to take the 7th-year apples, not the 6th-year apples. Now, how on earth, I'm looking at an apple tree, how on earth am I going to know when the apple budded and the like? It's a difficult question, but theoretically, that would be your achrayas to be able to figure out. Okay, now vegetables, so I talked about Shemitah fruit. Shemitah fruit, when we talk about vegetables and grain, there are going to be some extra complications, so we'll leave that for tomorrow.